Elias stood in the shadows, his heart pounding like a drum in a silent war. The backyard of his parents' sprawling Connecticut estate buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of privilege. But to him, it was a battlefield. He was their secret, their shame, hidden away like a stain they couldn't scrub out. The annual Whitmore Summer Gala was in full swing, a glittering affair of New England's elite. Doctors, lawyers, and old money heirs mingled under strings of fairy lights, their voices carrying over the soft jazz drifting from a live band. Elias, 24, pressed himself against the rough bark of a magnolia tree, his tailored blazer too tight around his shoulders, not from fit, but from the weight of being erased. His parents, Richard and Evelyn Whitmore, had made it clear he could attend, but only as a ghost. "We can't have that conversation tonight," his mother had whispered sharply that morning, her eyes darting as if his existence might scandalize the hydrangeas. He wasn't just their son. He was their gay son. And in their world of pressed linens and polished reputations, that was a flaw too jagged to fit. So, they'd tucked him into the background, a silent agreement to keep his truth locked away for the sake of their perfect facade. But Elias wasn't alone in his rebellion. Across the lawn, leaning against a wooden fence with a glass of bourbon in hand, was Caleb Monroe, the man who'd turned his world upside down. Caleb, 26, was everything the Whitmores disapproved of, a self-made photographer from a rough Brooklyn neighborhood, with a sharp jawline, tattoos peeking from his rolled-up sleeves, and a defiance that made Elias's pulse race. They'd met 3 months ago at a downtown art gallery, where Caleb's raw, unfiltered portraits of queer life had left Elias speechless. One conversation turned into coffee, then late-night talks, then stolen kisses in the back of Caleb's beat-up van. Now, Caleb was here, uninvited, a spark in the powder keg of Elias's carefully curated life. "Don't do anything stupid," Elias had texted him earlier, his fingers trembling. But Caleb's reply had been a single word: watch. That one syllable carried a promise, a dare, and it terrified Elias as much as it thrilled him. He watched Caleb now, the way he moved through the crowd with a predator's grace, charming a senator's wife with a smile while his eyes flicked to Elias. A silent vow. Elias's chest tightened. He wanted to run to him, to scream his truth to the stars, but fear chained him to the shadows. The band struck up a new song, and Evelyn's voice cut through the chatter, calling for attention. She stood on a small stage near the pool, her blonde hair impeccable, her smile a mask of control. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice syrupy with practiced warmth. "This gala is a celebration of family, tradition, and community." Elias's stomach twisted. Family. The word was a blade, slicing through the lie of his existence. He wasn't their family to neither was their secret. Caleb caught his eye again, and this time, there was no mistaking the fire in his gaze. He set his glass down on a table, his movements deliberate, and started weaving through the crowd toward the stage. Elias's breath hitched. "No," he whispered to himself, his hands clenching into fists. Caleb wouldn't. He couldn't. But the glint in Caleb's eye said otherwise. Elias's mind raced back to the night they'd first kissed, parked under a flickering streetlight in Caleb's van. "You're not invisible," Caleb had murmured against his lips, his voice rough with conviction. "You're a fucking supernova, Elias. Don't let them dim you." Those words had ignited something in Elias, a spark of courage he'd never known he had. But courage was dangerous in a world built on appearances. Now, as Caleb neared the stage, Elias's heart thundered. He knew his parents' rules: stay quiet, stay hidden, stay safe. But Caleb didn't play by their rules. He never had. And as Caleb's hand brushed the microphone stand, Elias realized that tonight, everything was about to change. The crowd hushed as Caleb stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding, unapologetic. Evelyn's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing as she registered the intruder. Richard, standing nearby, stiffened, his jaw tight. Elias felt the air shift, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Caleb didn't look at them. His gaze found Elias, steady and unwavering. And in that moment, Elias knew there was no going back. "Good evening," Caleb said into the microphone, his voice clear, cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "I'm not on the guest list, but I've got something to say." The crowd shifted, curious, some amused, others offended. Elias's pulse roared in his ears. He wanted to run, to pull Caleb away, to keep the fragile piece of his parents' world intact. But his feet stayed rooted, his eyes locked on Caleb, who stood like a beacon in the chaos. "This is a night about family, right?" Caleb continued, his tone sharp but warm, like a fire you couldn't look away from. "Well, I'm here for someone who's been told he doesn't belong in his own. Elias Whitmore is the bravest person I know, and he's standing right there, hidden because his truth makes some of you uncomfortable." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Evelyn's face drained of color, and Richard took a step forward, his fists clenched. Elias's world tilted. Caleb was tearing down the walls he'd spent years building, exposing him to a crowd that had never seen him. Not really. And yet, as Caleb's words echoed, something inside Elias cracked open, not with fear, but with a strange, wild hope. He wasn't invisible anymore. Caleb had seen him, and now, he was making sure everyone else did too. The stage was set, and the spotlight was on Elias. He could stay in the shadows, or he could step into the light. His choice would define everything. Caleb's voice hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in velvet. The crowd's murmurs grew into a low roar, a mix of shock and curiosity, as eyes darted toward Elias. He felt their stares like pinpricks, each one a reminder of the life he'd been taught to hide. His mother's face was a mask of fury, her lips pressed into a thin line, while his father's hand hovered near the event coordinator, ready to have Caleb dragged off the stage. But Elias couldn't move. His feet were cemented to the grass, his heart torn between terror and a reckless, soaring freedom. Caleb didn't flinch. "Elias," he said, his voice softening but still carrying over the microphone, "deserves to be here. Not as a guest, not as a secret, but as himself. He's your son, your friend, your brother. And he's gay. That's not a flaw, it's who he is." The word gay landed like a thunderclap, and Elias's breath caught. It was the first time he'd heard it spoken so boldly in this world of hushed whispers and closed doors. Evelyn stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the stage. "Young man," she said, her voice icy but polished, "this is a private event. You're causing a scene." The crowd nodded in agreement, some whispering about decorum, others about that boy's nerve. But Caleb just smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of his lips. "A scene," he said. "Good. Maybe it's time for one." Elias's mind spun. He could see the future his parents wanted, a quiet apology, a swift exit, and a return to the suffocating safety of their expectations. But Caleb's words were a lifeline, pulling him toward a different path. He thought of the nights they'd spent together, driving aimlessly through the city, Caleb's hand on his knee, the radio playing softly. "You don't have to hide forever," Caleb had said once, his voice low and fierce. "You're enough." Elias had wanted to believe him, but doubt had always crept in until now. He took a step forward, his legs trembling. The crowd parted slightly, their eyes tracking him like hawks. He felt exposed, raw, but Caleb's gaze anchored him. "Elias," Caleb said again, quieter now, almost a plea. "Come up here. Tell them who you are." The words were a spark, igniting something deep in Elias's chest. He'd spent years shrinking himself, folding his truth into smaller and smaller pieces until it barely existed. But Caleb saw him every jagged, beautiful piece, and he wasn't letting Elias disappear. Not tonight. Elias moved toward the stage, each step heavier than the last. His mother's eyes widened, a silent command to stop, but he ignored her. His father's voice boomed, "Elias, don't you dare." But it was too late. The crowd's murmurs faded into a distant hum as Elias climbed the steps, his heart pounding so loud he thought it might burst. He reached Caleb's side, and for a moment, the world was just the two of them. Caleb's hand brushed his, a fleeting touch that sent warmth flooding through him. "You got this," Caleb whispered, stepping back to give Elias the microphone. The weight of it in his hand was grounding, real. He turned to face the crowd, their faces a blur of judgment, curiosity, and something else, hope. Maybe, in a few. "I'm Elias Whitmore," he said, his voice shaking but growing steadier with each word. "And Caleb's right. I'm gay. I've been hiding it because I thought it was the only way to keep my family, my life. But I'm done hiding." The words poured out, raw and unpolished, but they carried a truth he'd buried for too long. "I love him," he said, glancing at Caleb, whose eyes shone with pride. "And I'm not ashamed of that." The crowd erupted, some in gasps, some in whispers, a few in tentative applause. Evelyn's face was a storm, but Elias didn't look at her. He looked at Caleb, at the man who'd given him the courage to stand here, exposed but unbroken. And then he saw something else, a young woman in the crowd, her eyes glistening, nodding faintly as if his words had unlocked something in her too. Richard stormed toward the stage, his face red with fury. "This is not the place," he hissed, grabbing Elias's arm. But Elias pulled free, his voice rising. "No, Dad. This is exactly the place. You've spent years pretending I'm someone I'm not. I'm done with that." The band faltered, the music dying into silence. The crowd was a sea of faces, some horrified, some moved, some unreadable. Elias's chest heaved, his breath ragged, but he felt alive in a way he never had before. Caleb stepped closer, his presence a steady anchor. "You're not alone," he murmured, just for Elias to hear. And then, from the back of the crowd, a voice called out, a woman, older, her voice trembling but clear. "Good for you, son." It was Mrs. Hargrove, a family friend who'd known Elias since he was a child. Her words were a crack in the dam, and suddenly, others joined in soft claps, murmurs of support, a few brave cheers. Not everyone, but enough to make Elias's heart swell. Evelyn turned away, her shoulders rigid, and Richard stood frozen, his anger warring with something deeper, shame, maybe, or fear. Elias didn't care. For the first time, he felt seen, not as the Whitmore's son, but as himself. And Caleb, standing beside him, was the reason why. But the night wasn't over. The crowd's support was fragile, and Elias knew his parents wouldn't let this go quietly. The real fight was just beginning. The air crackled with tension as Elias stepped off the stage, Caleb's hand grazing his back in silent reassurance. The crowd's applause, though scattered, felt like a lifeline, but Elias could see the storm brewing in his parents' eyes. Evelyn's face was a mask of icy control, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Richard, meanwhile, was already motioning to the security team, his jaw set in a way that promised consequences. Elias's heart pounded, but the weight of his words, the truth he'd finally spoken, kept him steady. Caleb leaned close, his voice low. "You were incredible up there." His eyes, warm and fierce, held Elias like an anchor in a hurricane. But before Elias could respond, Richard's voice cut through the hum of the crowd. "Elias, we need to talk. Now." It wasn't a request. Elias glanced at Caleb, who gave a subtle nod. "I'm right here," Caleb said, his tone a quiet vow. Elias squared his shoulders and followed his father toward the house, the crowd parting like a sea. Evelyn trailed behind, her heels clicking like a metronome of disapproval. The guests watched, some whispering, others pretending not to notice. But Elias felt their eyes like a weight on his spine. Inside the Whitmore's opulent study, the door slammed shut, sealing them in with the smell of leather and old books. Richard rounded on Elias, his face a thundercloud. "What the hell was that? Elias, you think you can humiliate us in front of our friends, our colleagues?" His voice was low, dangerous, the kind that had always made Elias shrink. "But not tonight. I wasn't trying to humiliate you," Elias said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I was trying to be honest. For once." Evelyn's laugh was sharp, brittle. "Honest? You call that stunt honesty? You and that boy have turned our family into a spectacle." She spat the word boy like it was poison, and Elias's chest tightened. Caleb wasn't just some boy. He was the one who'd shown Elias what it meant to live without fear, to love without shame. "You've always known who I am," Elias said, meeting her gaze. "You just didn't want anyone else to know. You hid me, Mom. You made me feel like I was something to be ashamed of." Richard slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Enough. This isn't about shame. It's about respect. For our family, our values, our legacy. You think you can just throw that away for some fling?" Elias's hands clenched into fists. "Caleb's not a fling. I love him. And I'm not throwing anything away. I am trying to live." His voice broke on the last word, and for a moment, the room was silent. Evelyn's eyes flickered, a crack in her composure, but she quickly looked away. "You're young," Richard said, his tone softer but still edged with control. "You don't understand what you're risking. Your future, your place in this family, my place." Elias interrupted, his voice rising. "What place?" "The one where I'm invisible unless I'm who you want me to be." He took a step forward, his fear giving way to a fire he hadn't known he possessed. "I'm done living for your approval." Evelyn's voice was cold, cutting. "And what do you expect us to do, Elias? Applaud you for this display? You've embarrassed us, alienated our friends." "Not all of them," Elias shot back, thinking of Mrs. Hargrove's voice, the scattered claps, the nods from strangers who'd seen him, really seen him, for the first time. "Some of them get it. Maybe you could too, if you tried." Richard's face darkened. "You're not to see that boy again. He's trouble, Elias. He's using you to make a point." Elias laughed, a bitter sound that surprised even him. "Caleb's the only one who's ever wanted me to be myself. You don't get to decide who I love." He turned toward the door, his heart racing but his resolve unbroken. "I'm not hiding anymore." As he stepped back into the night, the party's hum greeted him. Softer now, the crowd dispersed into smaller groups. Caleb was waiting by the magnolia tree, his silhouette sharp against the fairy lights. He didn't say anything, just opened his arms, and Elias fell into them, his breath shuddering. "I'm proud of you," Caleb murmured, his lips brushing Elias's forehead. "They're never going to accept this," Elias said, his voice muffled against Caleb's chest. "They'll try to control me, cut me off. Then we'll figure it out," Caleb said, pulling back to meet Elias's eyes. "Together. You're not alone in this. Okay." His hands cupped Elias's face, grounding him, and for a moment, the world felt conquerable. But the moment was shattered by a shout. "Elias!" It was Richard, storming across the lawn, 2 security guards in tow. The crowd turned, sensing the drama, and Elias's stomach dropped. Caleb tensed beside him, his body coiled like a spring. "Get him out of here," Richard barked, pointing at Caleb. "He's not welcome." Elias stepped in front of Caleb, his voice shaking but firm. "If he goes, I go." The words hung in the air, a line drawn in the sand. Richard's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Elias thought he saw something break in his father's expression: grief, maybe, or regret. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "Then go," Richard said, his voice cold. "But don't expect to come crawling back when this falls apart." Elias's heart stuttered, but Caleb's hand found his, squeezing tight. "Let's go," Caleb said softly, and together, they turned away from the party, from the life Elias had always known. The night stretched before them, uncertain but alive with possibility. The gravel crunched under Elias's shoes as he and Caleb walked away from the Whitmore estate, the glow of the party fading behind them. The night air was cool, sharp with the scent of pine, and Elias's breath came in short, jagged bursts. He just walked away from everything: his family, his home, the safety of a life he'd been groomed for. And yet, with Caleb's hand in his, he felt a strange, exhilarating freedom, like a bird escaping a cage it hadn't known it was in. Caleb's van was parked a block away, its chipped blue paint gleaming under a streetlight. They climbed inside, and for a moment, neither spoke. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable, filled with the weight of what had just happened. Elias stared at his hands, still trembling from the confrontation, and Caleb reached over, his fingers brushing Elias's wrist. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Elias laughed, a shaky sound. "I don't know. I told them. I told everyone. And now I don't know what happens next." He looked at Caleb, whose eyes were warm, unwavering. "What if I just ruined everything?" "You didn't ruin anything," Caleb said, leaning closer. "You were honest. That's not destruction, it's creation. You're building something real now, Elias. Something yours." He paused, his thumb tracing circles on Elias's hand. "And I'm here for it. All of it." Elias's throat tightened, and he leaned into Caleb, their foreheads touching. The van smelled of coffee and paint, a world away from the sterile elegance of his parents' home. Here, with Caleb, he could breathe. "I love you," he whispered, the words slipping out like a confession he'd held too long. Caleb's smile was soft, almost shy. "I love you too." He kissed Elias, slow and deep, and for a moment, the world outside the van didn't exist. It was just them, 2 hearts beating against the odds. But reality crept back in. Elias's phone buzzed in his pocket, a string of texts from his sister, Lila, who'd been at the party but silent during the chaos. "Where are you? Mom's freaking out. Call me." Elias stared at the screen, his stomach twisting. Lila was the only one in his family who'd ever seemed to understand, even a little. She'd caught him once, years ago, staring too long at a boy at a school dance, and instead of judging, She just squeezed his hand. But she was still a Whitmore, bound by the same rules that had suffocated him. I should call her, Elias said, but his voice lacked conviction. Caleb nodded, giving him space but staying close. Elias dialed, and Lila picked up on the first ring. Elias, what the hell? Her voice was sharp but laced with worry. You blew everything up. Mom's crying, Dad's raging, and half the guests are still talking about it. I didn't mean to hurt them, Elias said, his voice low. But I couldn't keep lying. Lila, I can't be their perfect son anymore. There was a pause, and when Lila spoke again, her tone was softer. I know. I get it. I just wish you'd told me first. I could have helped. Maybe. She sighed. Where are you? Are you with him? Yeah, Elias said, glancing at Caleb, who was watching him with quiet intensity. I'm with Caleb. I'm okay. Okay, Lila said, but there was a question in her voice, like she wasn't sure what okay meant anymore. Just be careful, Elias. They're not going to let this go. Dad's already talking about cutting you off. The words hit like a punch, but Elias nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Thanks for the heads up. I'll call you soon. He hung up, his chest tight. Caleb's hand found his again, grounding him. They can't control you anymore, Caleb said, his voice firm. You're free now? We'll figure out what's next. Elias wanted to believe him, but fear gnawed at the edges of his courage. He'd grown up with money, privilege, a safety net most people could only dream of. Now, that net was gone, and the future was a blank page. What if I can't do this? He asked, his voice small. What if I'm not strong enough? Caleb's eyes softened, but his voice was fierce. You just stood up to a room full of people who've spent years trying to erase you. You're stronger than you know. He started the van, the engine rumbling to life. Let's get out of here. Somewhere we can breathe. They drove into the night, the Connecticut suburbs giving way to the glow of New York City. Caleb's apartment in Brooklyn was small, cluttered with camera equipment and half-finished canvases, but it felt like a sanctuary. They collapsed onto the couch, Elias's head on Caleb's shoulder, the weight of the night settling around them. We'll need a plan, Elias said, his voice steadier now. A job, a place to stay. I've never had to think about this stuff before. Caleb chuckled, the sound warm and grounding. Welcome to the real world, Whitmore. It's messy, but it's ours. He kissed Elias's temple, his lips lingering. And we'll build it together. As Elias drifted toward sleep, Caleb's arms around him, he felt the first stirrings of something new, not just fear, but hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it was his to choose. Morning light filtered through the cracked blinds of Caleb's Brooklyn apartment, painting stripes across Elias's face as he woke. The couch was lumpy. The air smelled faintly of coffee and turpentine, but Elias felt a strange peace. For the first time, he wasn't waking up under the weight of his parents' expectations. Caleb was already up, brewing coffee in the tiny kitchen, his bare feet soft on the hardwood floor. Morning, Supernova, he said, grinning over his shoulder. The nickname, born from that first night in the van, made Elias's heart skip. They spent the day piecing together a plan. Elias had some savings, enough to cover a few months if he was careful, but he'd never worked a real job. The Whitmore name had always opened doors. Now, it felt like a liability. Caleb, ever practical, suggested starting small. There's a coffee shop near my studio, he said, handing Elias a mug. They're hiring. It's not glamorous, but it's a start. Elias nodded, the idea both daunting and exhilarating. A barista, he said, testing the word. Never thought I'd be that guy. But the thought of earning his own way, of building something outside his family's shadow, sparked a fire in him. Caleb had a shoot that afternoon, a portrait session for a local magazine, and Elias tagged along, watching him work. Caleb's energy was magnetic, his focus intense as he directed his subject, a trans activist named Marisol, with warmth and respect. Elias saw himself in Marisol's eyes, the quiet strength of someone who'd fought to be seen. "You're good at this," Elias said later, as they walked back to the apartment, the city buzzing around them. "It's not just about the photos," Caleb said, his camera bag slung over his shoulder. "It's about telling stories that matter. People like Marisol, like you, that deserve to be seen." He paused, his eyes searching Elias's. "You could do this too. You know. You've got an eye for it." Elias laughed, shaking his head. "Me? I don't know the first thing about photography." "You don't need to," Caleb said. "You feel things deeply. That's what makes a good artist." He stopped walking, turning to face Elias. "You've spent your whole life hiding. Now you get to create. What do you want to say?" The question lingered, heavy and full of possibility. Elias didn't have an answer yet, but it planted a seed. That night, Caleb showed him how to use his old DSLR, guiding his hands as they framed shots of the city skyline from the apartment's fire escape. It was clumsy, awkward, but Elias felt a sense of control he'd never had before. Days turned into weeks, and Elias settled into a rhythm. He got the barista job, burning his fingers on the espresso machine and fumbling orders, but learning fast. The coffee shop was a world away from the Whitmore estate, filled with artists, students, and misfits who didn't care about his last name. He started to feel like he belonged, like he could be more than a secret. But his family wasn't done with him. One evening, as he and Caleb were cooking dinner, a messy attempt at tacos, his phone buzzed with a voicemail from his mother. Her voice was clipped, formal. "Elias, we need to discuss your future. Your father and I are willing to forgive this lapse, but you need to come home. We'll be at the house this weekend. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Elias's stomach churned. Caleb, sensing the shift, set down his knife and pulled Elias close. "You don't owe them anything," he said, his voice firm. "But if you want to go, I'll go with you." Elias nodded, his throat tight. He didn't want to face them, but he knew he had to. Not to beg for forgiveness, but to prove to himself, to them, that he was done hiding. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "Let's do it." The drive back to Connecticut was quiet, the tension building with every mile. Caleb's hand rested on Elias's knee, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone. When they pulled up to the estate, the house loomed like a fortress, its windows cold and unyielding. Elias's heart raced, but Caleb's presence steadied him. Evelyn greeted them at the door, her face a mask of polite disdain. "Caleb," she said, her voice dripping with frost. "I didn't expect you." Richard stood behind her, his arms crossed, his silence louder than any words. "I'm here for Elias," Caleb said, his tone calm but unyielding. "He's not facing this alone." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but she stepped aside, gesturing them into the living room. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and Elias felt the weight of his old life pressing down. But he wasn't the same person who'd left. He'd tasted freedom, and he wasn't giving it back. "Elias," Richard began, his voice measured but hard. "We're prepared to reinstate your trust fund, your place in this family. But there are conditions." Elias's heart sank, but he held his father's gaze. "I'm not here to negotiate," he said. "I'm here to tell you who I am. And I'm not changing for you." The room fell silent, and Elias felt the world shift under his feet. This was his stand, his truth, and no matter what came next, he was ready. The living room of the Whitmore estate felt like a courtroom, with Elias on trial for the crime of being himself. Richard's offer hung in the air, a bribe dressed as forgiveness, a chance to slip back into the life they designed for him. But Elias's resolve was iron, forged in the weeks he'd spent building a life with Caleb, a life that was messy but real. He stood taller, his voice steady. "I don't want your money," he said. "I want your respect. And if you can't give me that, I don't need you." Evelyn's gasp was sharp, her hand flying to her chest as if Elias had struck her. "How dare you speak to us like that?" she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "After everything we've given you, you gave me a cage." Elias cut in, his words sharp but not cruel. "You gave me a life where I had to hide who I am. I'm not doing that anymore." He glanced at Caleb, who stood beside him, his presence a quiet strength. "I found something better." Richard's face was a storm, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something like doubt, or maybe fear. "You think this lifestyle is sustainable?" he said, his voice low. "You'll burn through your savings, Elias. You'll be back, begging, when this falls apart." Caleb stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. "He's not alone, Mr. Whitmore. And he's not as fragile as you think." His hand brushed Elias's, a subtle reminder of their shared strength. Elias felt a surge of gratitude, not just for Caleb's words, but for the life they were building, piece by piece. Evelyn's eyes darted between them, her composure cracking. "This is about family," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "We're trying to protect you, Elias. The world isn't kind to people like you." Elias's heart ached at the fear in her voice, but he shook his head. "The world's changing, Mom. And I'm not afraid of it anymore. I'm sorry if that scares you, but I can't live for your comfort." He paused, his voice softening. "I love you both. But I love myself too. And I'm choosing me." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower outside. Richard's shoulders slumped, just slightly, and Evelyn's eyes glistened, though she blinked the tears away. Elias waited, hoping for something, a word, a gesture, a sign they might try to understand. But Richard turned away, his voice cold. "If you walk out now, don't expect an open door." Elias nodded, his throat tight. "I know." He took Caleb's hand, and together they left the room, the weight of the moment trailing behind them like a shadow. As they stepped outside, the air felt lighter, the world brighter, despite the pain. Caleb squeezed his hand. "You did good," he said, his voice warm. "You're free." Back in Brooklyn, Elias threw himself into his new life with a hunger he hadn't known he had. The coffee shop job became a source of pride. Each latte, he poured a small victory. He started taking photos, too, under Caleb's guidance, capturing the raw beauty of the city, its graffiti-covered walls, its tired workers, its fleeting moments of joy. His first attempt was shaky, but Caleb framed one of his shots, a blurry image of a street performer in the rain, and hung it in the apartment. "Your first piece," he said, grinning. "You're an artist now." Elias laughed, but the word felt right. He was creating, not just surviving. He and Caleb spent nights talking about their dreams, Caleb's goal to open a gallery for queer artists, Elias's growing desire to tell stories through his lens. They were broke. Their apartment was a mess. But they were building something together. Something real. Lila reached out again, this time in person, showing up at the coffee shop one afternoon. She looked out of place in her designer coat, but her smile was genuine. "You look happy," she said, sitting across from him during his break. "Different." "I am," Elias said, stirring his coffee. "It's hard, but it's mine." He hesitated, then asked, "How are Mom and Dad?" Lila sighed. "They're processing. Mom keeps rereading your old letters from college, like she's looking for clues. Dad's quieter than usual. I think they're scared they've lost you." She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "I'm proud of you, Elias. And I'm here, okay?" Her words were a balm, and Elias felt a flicker of hope. Maybe not all was lost with his family. Maybe, in time, they'd see him. But for now, he had Caleb, Lila, and a growing circle of friends. Marisol, the activist from Caleb's shoot, and others who'd welcomed him into their world. One night, Caleb came home with a flyer for a local art show, his eyes bright with excitement. "They want me to exhibit," he said, pulling Elias into a hug. "And I want you to show something too. One of your photos." Elias's stomach flipped. "Mine? They're not good enough. They're yours," Caleb said, cutting him off. "That's enough." He kissed Elias, his lips warm and sure, and Elias felt the seed of courage he'd planted weeks ago begin to bloom. The art show was a month away, and Elias threw himself into preparing, his camera becoming an extension of himself. The future was still uncertain, but it was his, and he was ready to claim it. The art show was held in a converted warehouse in Dumbo, its brick walls lined with bold, unapologetic works, paintings, sculptures, and photographs that screamed of life and defiance. Elias's nerves buzzed as he adjusted his framed photo, a black and white shot of Caleb laughing in the rain, his eyes bright with joy. It was raw, imperfect, but it was his truth, captured in a single frame. Caleb's hand rested on his shoulder, a steady anchor as the room filled with artists, critics, and curious locals. "You nervous?" Caleb asked, his voice low, teasing. "Terrified," Elias admitted, but he grinned. "But I'm here." That alone felt like a miracle. Months ago, he'd been a shadow at his parents' party, hidden for who he was. Now, he was standing in a room full of strangers, his heart on display for the world to see. The crowd moved through the exhibit, their voices a hum of admiration and critique. Elias's photo drew attention, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. A woman with a buzz cut and a nose ring paused in front of it, her eyes softening. "This is beautiful," she said, glancing at Elias. "It feels alive." Elias's chest swelled, and he murmured a thank you, his voice catching. Caleb squeezed his shoulder, pride radiating from him. "Told you," he whispered. "You've got something to say." As the night wore on, Elias felt a shift in himself. He wasn't just the Whitmore heir, or the gay son, or Caleb's boyfriend. He was Elias, an artist, a dreamer, a man carving his own path. The realization was dizzying, like stepping into sunlight after years in the dark. Then, through the crowd, he saw a familiar face, Lila, slipping in quietly, her coat draped over her arm. She caught his eye and smiled, a mix of pride and nervousness. Elias's heart skipped. He hadn't expected her. Not here. Not after everything. "Lila," he said, crossing the room to meet her. "You came." "Of course I did," she said, pulling him into a hug. "I wanted to see what you're building." She glanced at his photo, her smile widening. It's incredible. Elias. Really? They talked for a while, the noise of the show fading into the background. Lila told him their parents were still struggling, but she'd overheard Evelyn talking about him with a softness she hadn't heard before. Give them time, Lila said. They're stubborn, but they love you. They just don't know how to show it yet. Elias nodded, hope flickering but tempered by reality. He didn't need their approval anymore, but he wanted their understanding. Someday. For now, he had Lila, Caleb, and a world that was starting to see him. As the show wound down, Caleb took the stage to thank the organizers, his voice warm and commanding. Then, to Elias's surprise, he turned to him. There's someone here who deserves to be recognized, Caleb said, his eyes locking on Elias. Elias Whitmore walked away from everything to be himself. That's the kind of courage we're celebrating tonight, art that tells the truth, no matter the cost. The room erupted in applause, and Elias's face burned, but he couldn't stop smiling. Caleb pulled him onto the stage, and for a moment, they stood together, hands clasped, the world watching. Elias's heart pounded, not with fear, but with joy. He wasn't hidden anymore. He was seen, loved, and free. Later, as they walked home through the Brooklyn streets, Caleb's arm around his shoulders, Elias felt the weight of the night settle into something solid, something lasting. I didn't know I could do this, he said, his voice soft. Be this. Caleb stopped, turning to face him under a flickering streetlight. You were always this, he said, his voice fierce with love. You just needed to see it. Elias kissed him, the city humming around them, and in that moment, he knew he'd found his place not in a mansion or a trust fund, but in the life he was building, one honest step at a time. The road ahead would be hard, but it was his, and with Caleb by his side, he was ready for anything. The stars above Brooklyn shone brighter than ever, and Elias Whitmore, once a secret, was now a story his own, and he was telling it loud.